The message arrived 11 hours before the warship did, and it was the calmest thing the Vorthani choir had ever heard. It came in on every channel at once, not loud, not jammed into their frequencies the way a desperate fleet floods the dark when it knows it is dying. This came folded into the carrier wave so neatly that the listening posts of the choir mistook it for a fault in their own instruments for almost a full minute. 340 relay stations stretched across the Mael reach, and every one of them reported the same 9 words at the same instant, which is impossible, because light does not travel that fast, and the choir had spent 4,000 years making certain that nothing did. The 9 words were these: brace yourself. A human warship is incoming. Nothing survives. In the choir's tongue there is no clean way to say warship. Their language has 14 words for harmony, and 1 borrowed, ugly word, for the thing that breaks it. So when the translation matrices reached for a meaning, they hesitated, and the hesitation was logged, and the log is the only reason anyone outside the reach knows what happened there. A scribe named Olin Vray was on watch when the words came. Olin counted things. Olin's task, for 212 years, had been to record the temperature of dead stars, and Olin had never in all that time recorded anything that frightened him. He read the 9 words. He read them again. Then he did the thing scribes are trained never to do, which is to send a question back up the chain before the data is verified, and the question he sent was a single word, and the word was, simply, whose. The Vorthani choir did not believe in ships the way other peoples did. To understand what happened over the Mael reach, you have to understand that first. The choir did not build hulls and fill them with crew and send them out to be shot at. The choir had learned, long ago, in a war whose name they had since erased, that matter is a weakness. Matter can be struck, matter can be burned, so the choir had stopped relying on it. They reached down past the skin of the universe and they learned to fold it. Where a Vorthani vessel wished to go, the distance simply ceased to be there. Where a Vorthani weapon wished to strike, the rules that say a thing cannot be in 2 places, or that a thing once whole cannot be quietly unmade, were politely set aside for the duration of the strike. The choir did not outshoot their enemies, they edited them. They reached into the law that held an enemy fleet together, and they loosened 1 clause, and the fleet came apart not in fire but in confusion, every bolt and beam and bone, deciding all at once that it had never agreed to be a fleet in the first place. In 4,000 years, no one had ever survived a Vorthanani edit. Not a single hull, not a single soul. There were no veterans of war against the choir, because the choir did not leave veterans. They left silence, and into the silence they sang, which is why their enemies called them the choir, and why their enemies, when they spoke of them at all, spoke quietly. So when Olin Vray sent the word whose up the chain, the answer that came back down was meant to comfort him, and it failed. The answer was that the warship belonged to humanity, and humanity, the elders said, was a young thing, a wet, brief, fragile thing, from a single blue world, far down the Orion shelf. The humans built hulls, they filled them with crew, they sent them out to be shot at. The choir had brushed against humanity once, 60 years ago, at the edge of a contested arm, and had edited a human scouting cutter out of existence in under 2 seconds, and the humans had not even understood what had killed them. The elders said all of this to comfort the scribe. And then the second message arrived, and it was worse than the first, because the second message was not a warning. The second message was a correction. It said, "We know what you do. We have watched you edit the law for 4,000 years. We brought a ship that the law cannot reach. Brace yourself. Nothing survives." Olin Vray set down his stylus. In the long, quiet halls of the relay station, a thing that should not have been possible was happening, and Olin, who counted things, was the first of his people to notice it. The numbers on his instruments were drifting, not failing, not jamming, drifting, the way numbers drift when the thing they measure is being slowly approached by something that does not belong in the equation. He pulled the station's deep records. The choir kept everything. Every edit they had ever performed, every law they had ever loosened, every enemy they had ever unmade, was written in the deep records. 4,000 years of victories with no defeats among them. Olin searched the records for the word human. He found the scouting cutter, 60 years gone, 2 seconds to nothing. He found one other entry. The other entry was a warning the choir had filed about itself. It had been written by an editor named Thelm Sa, who was, in the way the choir reckoned such things, one of the great singers of her age. Thelm Sa had performed 11,000 edits in her life and lost nothing, and near the end of that life, she had filed a single note in the deep records, and the note had been read by almost no one because it made no sense and predicted no enemy and named no threat. Olin read it now. Thelm Sa had written, "We win because we change the rules. One day, we will meet a people who do not play by rules at all. On that day, our gift will be a closed door, and what is behind the door will not knock." Olin Vray read the note of Thelm Sa, and then he looked again at the second message from the human ship, and the two of them fit together like a key turning, and for the first time in 212 years, the scribe who counted dead stars was afraid of a living thing. He did not understand the fear at first. He examined it the way he examined everything, slowly, from a distance, the way a careful creature turns a strange object over in its hands before deciding what it is. He had read the records of the choir's old wars. He knew what fear of an enemy was supposed to feel like, and this was not it. Fear of an enemy was a fast thing, a bright thing, the kind of feeling that made a creature reach for a weapon. This was slow and gray and patient, and it did not want him to reach for anything. It wanted him to sit very still, and after a while, Olin understood why, and the understanding was worse than the fear. He was not afraid of the human ship the way one is afraid of an enemy. He was afraid of it the way one is afraid of a true thing one has spent a long time pretending not to know. The fear was not new. The human ship had not brought it. The human ship had only said it out loud, in 9 clean words on every channel at once. The thing the choir had been refusing to say to itself for 4,000 years. That one day the editing would meet something it could not edit. That the door Thelm Sa had warned about was real. That it had a name now, and the name was the last good reason, and it was 11 hours out and coming. He pulled the surface records, the recent ones, the ones the choir actually read, to see whether anyone in the 4,000 years between Thelm Sa and now had thought about the warning at all. He found that they had, twice. The first was a young editor, 300 years dead, who had proposed building a defense against an enemy who would not obey an edit, and had been laughed out of the great halls, because the choir could not imagine such an enemy, and saw no reason to defend against a thing that did not exist. The second was a philosopher, 100 years dead, who had written a single careful paper asking what the choir would do on the day it met a people who simply did not care what the choir had decided was true. The paper had no answer in it. It had only the question, and at the end, a line that Olin read 3 times. "We have never lost," the philosopher had written, "and so we have never learned the only thing that losing teaches, which is that you are not the only one who is real." Olin closed the surface records. The choir had been warned 3 times across 4,000 years, by its own finest minds, and 3 times it had done nothing, because nothing had ever forced it to, and now the thing that would force it was 11 hours out, and getting closer, and it was too late to build the defense the young editor had proposed, and there was no answer at the end of the philosopher's question, and there never had been. He sounded the deep alarm. It had not been sounded in 900 years. Across the Melel Reach, in the great folded halls where the choir sang the universe smaller, the editors woke and reached for their instruments, and asked the same question Olin had asked, and received the same answer, and most of them laughed. A wet world, a brief people, a hull made of matter, crude by things that bled. Let it come into the reach where the law was theirs to bend, and they would loosen one clause as they had loosened 10,000 before, and the human warship would decide, all at once, that it had never agreed to exist. The editors were not afraid. The editors had never lost. That was the trouble with the editors, and Olin Vray, counting the drift in his instruments, was beginning to understand it. He sent a 3rd query up the chain, his own this time, not a relay. He asked the elders to tell him the name of the human ship. He did not know why it mattered. It mattered to him. A counted thing has a name, and a named thing is real, and Olin wanted to know exactly how real the thing approaching the reach had become. The answer came back slowly, because the choir had to reach far down the shelf to find it, into the chatter of the young wet people and their loud, brief lives. And when the answer came, it was 4 words. and the 4 words sat on Olin's screen and did not drift, did not waver, did not fold, while everything else in the station bent quietly around them. The ship was called The Last Good Reason. Olin did not know what the name meant. He did not know that on the human world, it was an old phrase, the kind a tired parent gives a child who keeps asking why a thing must be done. He did not know that the people who built the ship had argued for a long time over whether to build it at all, and that the name was the end of the argument, the thing one of them had finally said to win it. The last good reason. The reason you stop talking and start working. The reason that is also a threat. Olin knew none of that. He knew only that the name would not drift, and that in 4,000 years of editing the law, the choir had never met a number, a word, or a thing that would not drift when they reached for it. He looked out through the station's great window, down the dark throat of the male reach, toward the place where the human ship would enter their folded space in 11 hours. There was nothing to see yet. There would not be, for a long time. But Olin Vray, scribe and counter of dead stars, sat very still and watched the dark anyway, the way a small creature watches the quiet grass when it knows, without knowing how it knows, that something large has begun to move. Behind him, the deep alarm sang on, unanswered by anyone who took it seriously. There was one more thing Olin did in those first hours, and it was the thing that marked him out from every other Vorthani alive. He went back and read the warning a 4th time, slowly, the way he read the temperature of a dead star, and he counted the words in it, because that was what he did. He counted things, and the count told him something the elders had missed. The warning had come in 3 pieces. Brace yourself. A human warship is incoming. Nothing survives. And Olin noticed that the humans had not said, "You will not survive," and they had not said, "The choir will not survive," and they had not even said, "You die." They had said, "Nothing survives." It was a stranger and colder claim than a threat, because a threat is aimed at someone, and this was not aimed at anyone. It was simply a description of what was coming, the way one might describe weather, or the tide, or the turning of a season. Nothing survives. Not the editors, not the records, not the 4,000 years of victories. Not even, Olin understood with a slow, cold dread, the certainty that had made all of it possible. The humans were not promising to kill his people. They were promising that the thing his people were, the thing they had been since the war whose name they had erased, would not be there on the far side of the day. And a thing that is not there does not survive, whether or not its body keeps breathing, and Olin was the only Vorthani in the whole of the Reach who read the warning closely enough to understand that the humans had told the exact and total truth, in 9 plain words, 11 hours before they arrived to make it so. The choir had 11 hours. They believed it was 11 hours in which to prepare an edit. It was 11 hours in which to brace. The first editor to reach for the human ship was named Korun Dal, and he had never failed at anything in his 800 years of life. Korun Dal was not arrogant in the way the young are arrogant. He was arrogant in the deeper, calmer way of a thing that has simply never been wrong. He had unmade 41 fleets. He had loosened the law that held together a war moon and watched it become a slow rain of harmless dust. He had once, on a wager, edited a star so that it had never formed, and the species that had orbited it had quietly never existed, and Korun Dal had felt nothing about this at all. He was the finest singer the choir had produced in 3 centuries, and when the deep alarm sang, he silenced it with a flick of irritation and took the human ship as his own. He found it easily. The last good reason was 9 hours out now, sliding up the throat of the male reach at a speed that was, by the choir's reckoning, almost insultingly slow. It made no effort to hide. It did not jam. It did not fold space around itself the way a frightened thing curls inward. It simply came, a long dark hull, 11 kilometers from blunt nose to blunt stern, built of dense gray matter, and lit along its flanks by the dull orange glow of something burning very hot and very controlled deep inside it. Korun Dal looked at it the way a master looks at a clumsy student, and he reached for the law that held it together, and he began to sing. His edit was simple. It was the first edit any apprentice learned. He reached for the clause in the law of the ship that said its forward hull is joined to its aft hull, and he loosened it. Just that. A small thing. The ship would decide, gently, that its front and its back had never been introduced, and it would come apart at the seam, and the wet, brief people inside would spill into the dark, and that would be that. He sang the edit. He felt it leave him, clean and true, the way 10,000 edits had left him before. And the edit arrived at the human ship, and the human ship did not come apart. Corundal paused. This had never happened. An edit did not fail. An edit could not fail, any more than a dropped stone could refuse to fall. He examined the ship again, and what he found made the calm old certainty in him flicker for the first time in his long life. The clause was still there. His edit had reached the ship. It had touched the law that held the hull together, and the law had simply declined. Not resisted, not pushed back. The choir knew how to handle resistance. Resistance was a thing you overpowered with a louder song. This was not resistance. This was the law looking at his edit and considering it and choosing not to apply. It was as if the human ship had read the rules of the universe, found the clause that said it must obey an edit, and quietly crossed it out. Corundal sang the edit again, louder. He poured 800 years of skill into it. He loosened not one clause but a dozen, reaching for the very atoms of the hull, telling them they were never bound, never joined, never anything but free dust drifting in the dark. The song that left him would have unmade a war moon in an eye blink. It reached the last good reason, and the last good reason kept coming, exactly as it had, not faster, not slower, 11 kilometers of gray matter, lit by dull orange fire, 9 hours becoming 8.5, sliding up the throat of the reach toward the folded heart of the choir. For the first time, Corundal stopped singing and listened instead. He reached out with the deep sense the editors used, the sense that let them feel the shape of the law around a thing. He felt the human ship, and what he felt there did not make sense, and it took him a long time to find words for it, because his language had 14 words for harmony and 1 for the thing that breaks it, and it had no word at all for this. The human ship was not protected. That was the thing. A protected thing has a shield, a wall, a song of its own pushing back against the edit. The last good reason had nothing of the kind. It was not pushing back. It was simply built, in some way Corundal could not see, so that the law that everything else in the universe obeyed slid off of it like water off oiled stone. The humans had not learned to fight the edit. They had learned to be the kind of thing the edit does not apply to. Corundal had spent 800 years learning to change the rules, and the humans, somewhere down on their wet blue world, had spent their own long, bitter centuries learning the only thing that beats a creature who changes the rules. They had built a thing that does not have any. He tried a third time, and a fourth, and each time he changed his approach, because Corundal had not lived 800 years by repeating a thing that did not work. The third time he did not reach for the hull at all. He reached for the orange fire in the ship's belly, the controlled burning that drove it up the throat of the reach, and he loosened the law that said the fire was hot. Fire that is not hot is not fire. The ship would go dark and cold and dead in the water, and the wet, brief crew would freeze in their gray hull, and Corundal would not even have to unmake them. He would simply let the dark do it. He sang the edit. He reached for the fire. And the fire declined, exactly as the hull had declined, and went on burning, hot and controlled and indifferent, driving the ship forward at the same insulting speed it had held the whole way in. Corundal felt the fire refuse him, and he understood that the humans had not lit it the way the choir lit anything, with a principle that could be softened and a law that could be loosened. They had lit it the way a tired creature lights a fire at the end of a long cold day, with a hand that means it, and a hand that means it does not consult the universe about whether the fire is permitted. The fourth time, Corundal reached not for the ship, but for the space around it. If he could not edit the hull, he would edit the dark the hull was sailing through. He loosened the law that said the space ahead of the ship led to the heart of the reach, and he tried to fold it, gently, so that the human ship's path curved away into the empty dark, away from the choir, away from the great halls, out into the long nothing between the stars where it could sail forever and arrive nowhere. This was a thing the choir did 1,000 times a day. Distance was the most negotiable thing they knew. The space declined. This was the moment Corundal stopped being merely puzzled and began, for the first time in his long life, to be afraid. The hull he could almost understand. The fire he could almost understand. But the space around the ship was not the ship. It was the reach itself, the folded dark the choir had owned for 4,000 years, the one thing in all creation that had always done what the choir told it. And it would not fold, not near the human ship. As if the last good reason carried its own small region of plain hard reality with it wherever it went, a bubble of stubborn fact 11 kilometers wide, inside which the law was simply the law, and could not be loosened, and did not negotiate, and did not care. The humans had not built a ship that resisted the edit. They had built a ship that brought its own universe, and in that universe the choir's 4,000 years of mastery meant exactly nothing. Korun Dal pulled back from the ship, shaken, and he did something he had not done in 300 years. He asked for help. The choir came. They came in their dozens, the great singers of the Mael Reach, woken by the deep alarm and drawn by the impossible thing Korun Dal had reported, which most of them did not believe until they reached for the human ship themselves and felt their own edits decline. One by one they tried, one by one they failed. They reached for the hull, and it would not part. They reached for the orange fire in its belly, and it would not cool. They reached for the wet brief crew inside, and they could not even find them, because the crew, too, sat behind the same closed door, and the door did not knock, and the door did not open, and the door, as Thelm Sa had written 900 years before, did not knock back either. There were 60 editors in the great halls of the Mal Reach, who were strong enough to attempt a high edit, and over the next 2 hours, all 60 of them tried. Allen watched their names scroll past his station in the order they failed. Velis Tor, who had unmade a war fleet of 900 hulls in a single breath, reached for the human ship, and felt her edit slide off and vanish into the dark. Senan Hal, oldest of the living editors, 1,200 years on the song, reached for the crew, and could not even find them behind the closed door. Drenosa, the youngest of the 60, barely 200, wept openly when her edit failed, because she had never in her short life felt a thing decline her, and she did not have the long calm of the older singers to hide behind. One by one the names scrolled, and one by one they failed, 60 of the finest minds the choir had produced in 4,000 years, reaching for a hull of plain gray matter, and finding nothing there that would bend. And the whole time, the last good reason came on. 7 hours out, 6.5. It did not speed up to escape them, and it did not slow down to taunt them. It held its course and its speed with the terrible patience of a thing that has already decided how the day will go, and sees no reason to hurry toward the ending. Olin, watching, understood that the patience was itself a kind of message. A frightened ship runs. A confident ship charges. The last good reason did neither. It simply walked, and the walking said, more clearly than any weapon, that there was nothing the choir could do that would change the distance between where the ship was and where it was going, and so there was no reason to do anything but walk. Allen Vray watched all of this from his relay station, reading the editors' reports as they scrolled past, and he noticed something the editors in their growing panic had not. The human ship had not yet fired. In 8 hours of approach, with the finest singers of the choir reaching into its hull and trying to unmake it, the last good reason had not loosed a single weapon. It had not so much as turned, it simply came on, patient and gray, like a verdict walking toward a courtroom that has not yet realized it is the one on trial. This frightened Olun more than any weapon would have. A weapon was a thing that wanted something. A weapon could be bargained with, dodged, absorbed. The human ship wanted nothing. It was not trying to win. Winning was a thing you did against an opponent you respected as an equal. The human ship was not treating the choir as an opponent. It was treating them as a chore. He pulled the deep records again. He searched for the human cutter, the one the choir had edited out of existence 60 years before, 2 seconds to nothing, and he read the full entry this time, all of it, not just the summary the elders had quoted to comfort him. The full entry was longer than the summary. The choir had recorded, in their thorough way, the last transmission of the human cutter before it was unmade. The cutter's crew had not begged. They had not even seemed afraid. The last words from the human cutter, recorded 60 years before and filed away and never read, had been a single calm sentence, sent not to the choir, but back home, to the wet blue world, a report. The report said, "Found the ones who edit the law, recommend we build something they cannot. And under that, in the dry hand of the choir scribe who had filed it, a single note. Threat assessment, negligible. Species lacks the capacity to act on the recommendation. Alan-Vray read the note of the scribe who had come before him, and he understood, with the cold clarity of a man watching a flood reach the bottom of his own door, exactly how wrong his people had been. The humans had not lacked the capacity. The humans had spent 60 years acting on the recommendation. The cutter had not been a defeat. The cutter had been a scout, and the scout had found exactly what it was sent to find, and it had died sending the answer home, and the answer had been built, and the answer was now 8 hours out and sliding up the throat of the reach, and its name was The Last Good Reason. A handful of voices in the great halls did listen, near the end, when listening could no longer save them, but might still tell them what was true. An elder named Quarren, one of the oldest singers alive, read the full cutter entry that Olin had sent up the chain, and Quarren did a thing the choir had never recorded one of its elders doing. He proposed flight. He stood in the great folded halls, before the 60 editors who were braiding themselves toward the great loosening, and he said, in the formal harmony reserved for matters of the whole people, that the human ship could not be edited, and that a thing which could not be edited could not be stopped, and that the only sane course was to scatter, to fold the young and the records and the colony folds out to the deep rim and beyond, and to let the human ship arrive at an empty heart. The editors did not laugh at Quarren, because the failures had frightened them too much for laughter, but they did not follow him. They could not. To follow Quarren would have meant admitting that the choir, in 4,000 years, had built a power that could be beaten, and the admission was a heavier thing to lift than the human ship itself. So they thanked the elder for his counsel, in the formal harmony, and they turned back to the great loosening, and they reached again for the gray hull that would not bend. Quarren, alone, took a small fold ship and 100 of the youngest children, and slipped out toward the deep rim, while there was still a rim to slip toward. He was one of the few who would later be counted among the living, and he would spend the rest of his life unable to explain to anyone why he had run, when no Vorthani had ever run, except to say that he had read a report from a dying cutter and believed it, which was a thing his whole people had been unable to do until it was far too late. Olin, at his station, watched the elders' fold ship leave the great halls, and he understood the shape of what was happening better than anyone still inside them. The choir was not being destroyed by a weapon. It was being destroyed by a certainty, its own. The certainty that everything could be talked into changing, and the human ship had not come to argue against the certainty, but simply to be the one thing in creation that proved it false. And a people cannot survive the disproving of the thing they built themselves upon. The ones who lived would be the ones who had stopped believing it in time. Quarren had. Olin had. Almost no one else would. Olin sent the full entry up the chain, marked urgent, marked reread, marked we were wrong. He did not know if anyone would listen. The editors were singing now, all of them at once, the deepest and oldest songs the choir possessed, the songs they had used to unmake stars, and the throat of the male reach trembled with the force of 40 editors, all reaching for one gray hull at the same time, trying to find the one clause, the one law, the one rule, that the human ship could be made to obey. There was no such clause. There was no such law. The humans had not protected themselves from every rule. They had built a ship that simply was not subject to rules at all. A thing of such plain, dense, stubborn matter, welded and bolted and crewed by hands, that had been taught not one trick of physics but one habit of mind. The human habit. The oldest human habit. The refusal to accept that anything was impossible, just because the universe insisted on it. Korun Dal, 800 years old, finest singer in 3 centuries, sat in the center of the choir's failing song and felt something he had no word for, and the word, had he possessed it, would have been despair. He gathered himself. He was not finished. The editors had one more thing to try, the thing they kept for the worst of enemies, the edit they called the Great Loosening, in which the choir did not change one law, but reached for the whole local fabric of the universe and made it briefly negotiable, a region of space some thousands of kilometers across, in which nothing was fixed, nothing was certain, and anything the choir wished to be true became true by acclamation. They had used it 4 times in 4,000 years. Each time, An enemy empire had simply stopped having ever been. Corun Dal called for the great loosening. The choir gathered to it. They would let the human ship sail into the heart of the Reach, into the region they would make negotiable, and there, where even matter held only the shape the choir permitted it, the last good reason would learn that its trick of being unruled meant nothing, because in the great loosening, there were no rules left for it to be exempt from. There would only be the will of the choir, and the will of the choir was that the human ship had never been built. It was, Corun Dal told himself, an elegant answer. A door cannot stay shut if you unmake the wall around it. He did not yet understand that he had misjudged what the last good reason was. None of them did. They thought it was a ship that ignored the rules. They were about to learn that it was a ship that had come to teach them one. 8 hours out. The last good reason slid up the throat of the mile Reach, gray and patient and silent, and far behind it, 11 hours and 4,000 years too late, the Vorthani choir finally began, in earnest, to brace. Olin Vray watched the editors prepare the great loosening, and he did a thing scribes are not permitted to do. He opened a channel to the human ship, not to fight it. He had no weapon, not to beg. He did not think it would listen. He opened the channel because he counted things, and he wanted, before the end of the only certainty his people had ever known, to ask the thing approaching them a single question. He sent it in the plainest form he had, stripped of harmony, stripped of the choir's 14 graces, a flat, ugly line of meaning aimed down the dark throat of the Reach, at 11 kilometers of gray matter. He asked, "What did we do to you?" He did not expect an answer. The human ship had spoken twice, both times to warn, never to converse. A thing that treats you as a chore does not stop to explain the chore. But the last good reason answered. It answered in the same flat, plain, ugly line he had used, no harmony, no grace. As if it had reached down and chosen his exact register so that he, and only he, of all the choir, would understand it without translation. It said, 60 years ago, you unmade 4 people who came to look at you, and you filed it under negligible. We are not here for revenge. Revenge is small. We are here because a people who can edit the law will not stop at 4, and will not stop at us, and will not stop until someone builds a thing the edit cannot reach and walks it into the place the editing is done. You are that place. We are that thing. Olin read it. He read it again, and then the last good reason added one more line, and the line was for him alone, the scribe who counted dead stars, the only one of the choir who had read the old warnings and believed them. It said, "You already know how this ends. You read Thelm Saw. Tell the others to brace. It will be quicker for them if they are not singing." Olin Vray turned from his instruments. Behind him, in the great folded halls, 40 editors gathered the most powerful working in the history of his people, the great loosening, the unmaking of all rules, and they aimed it at a ship that did not obey any. And Olin, who had spent 212 years recording the temperature of dead stars, opened a station-wide channel and told his people, in a voice they had never heard him use, to brace. Almost none of them listened. The ones who did were the only ones who would have anything left to remember it with. The great loosening took 6 hours to build, and the last good reason gave them every minute of it without complaint. This, more than anything, was what broke the nerve of the younger editors. The human ship knew. It had told the scribe exactly how the thing would end, and knowing, it slowed for nothing, hid behind nothing, and waited for nothing. It let the choir gather the largest working in their history, the unmaking of all rules across a region of space 9,000 kilometers wide, and it sailed straight toward the center of that region, as if being unmade were simply the next item on a list it intended to finish before dark. Corun Dal led the working. 40 editors joined to him, their songs braided into one, and at the heart of the male Reach, the fabric of the universe began to soften. Stars in the region dimmed and brightened at the choir's pleasure. Distances stretched and folded. A passing comet, caught at the edge of the loosening, briefly had never existed, and then was permitted to exist again, confused, in a slightly different orbit. Within the great loosening, there were no fixed laws, no certainties, nothing the human ship could be exempt from, because there was nothing left to be exempt from at all. Only the will of the choir, total and absolute, in a region the size of a small empire. The last good reason crossed into the loosening at the 4th hour, and Karun Dal sang the unmaking, and the unmaking was that the human ship had never been built. The region of softened space accepted the command. Across 9,000 kilometers, reality agreed that there had never been a ship called the last good reason, that no wet brief people had ever bolted 11 kilometers of gray matter together and lit a fire in its belly and sent it up the throat of the reach. The command was true. In the great loosening, the choir's word was the only law there was, and the choir's word was that the ship was not there, and the ship was there. It came on through the softened space, gray and patient, exactly as real as it had been an hour before, while all around it, the universe obediently agreed it did not exist. The contradiction should have been impossible. The great loosening had unmade 4 empires. Reality had never once argued. But the human ship was not part of reality's argument. That was the thing the choir had never understood and could not understand, because they had spent 4,000 years learning to win every argument and had never once met a thing that simply refused to have the conversation. The last good reason did not believe it had never been built. It did not believe anything. It was a hull and a fire and a crew, and it was here, and the opinion of the local universe on the matter was, to it, weather. The humans had not made their ship immune to the edit. They had made their ship indifferent to it. And there is no working in any tongue, no song in any choir, that can edit a thing which does not care what you have decided is true. Karun Dal felt the unmaking fail, and in the moment it failed he understood, at last and far too late, what Thelm Sa had meant. Our gift will be a closed door. The choir's whole power rested on a single hidden assumption, so deep they had never once examined it. They had assumed that everything in the universe could be talked into changing. Stars could be talked out of forming. Fleets could be talked out of holding together. Matter could be talked out of being matter. The choir had never met an exception, and so they had never imagined one. And so they had built their entire civilization on the soft ground of a rule they had never tested. The humans had tested it. The humans had sent a cutter to find the talkers, and the cutter had died sending home the one thing that beats them, and the one thing was not a better argument. It was a thing that does not listen. And now the thing that does not listen was at the center of the great loosening, in the region where the choir's will was the only law, and it was here that the second half of Thelm Sa's warning came due. The door does not knock. The choir had never feared the human ship's weapons, because the human ship had no weapon that could matter against editors who lived behind folded space. They were right. The last good reason did not need a weapon that could matter against the choir. It needed only the choir's own working, still running, still holding 9,000 kilometers of reality soft and negotiable, with no fixed law left in it at all. The humans had read the cutter's report. They had spent 60 years studying the edit, not to copy it. They could not copy it, but to understand its one weakness. And the weakness was this: to edit the law, the choir first had to loosen it. To unmake an enemy, they first had to make a region where nothing was certain. The choir's power was a region with no rules, and a region with no rules is the most dangerous place in the universe to bring a thing that does not obey any. The last good reason reached the center of the great loosening, and it did the one thing the choir had never planned for, because no enemy had ever lived long enough inside the loosening to do it. It stopped agreeing. In the softened space, the only thing holding reality together was the will of the choir. 40 editors, braided into one, sang the local universe into whatever shape they pleased, and into that song, into the soft place where the choir's word was the only law, the human ship simply set down its own plain, dense, indifferent fact. It is real, it is here, it does not care what you have decided. And in a region where nothing was fixed, where the only law was agreement, a thing that refused to agree was not a contradiction, the choir could overrule. It was a splinter the loosening could not close around. The choir had made the universe soft, so they could reshape it. The human ship was the one thing in creation that stayed hard, and the soft thing broke against the hard thing, the way it always does, the way it had always done on the wet blue world where the humans had learned, across 10,000 years of their own brief brutal history, that the stubborn fact outlasts the clever argument every single time. The great loosening turned inward. Karun Dal felt it go first, a working that holds reality soft, must hold itself soft too. And the moment the human ship refused to soften, the loosening had nowhere left to spend its force, but back along the song that made it, back into the 40 editors braided at its heart, back into the great folded halls of the Mael Reach, where the choir had sung the universe smaller for 4,000 years. The unmaking they had aimed at the human ship found nothing there to unmake, and an unmaking that finds nothing does not stop. It turns. It looks for the nearest thing that is willing to come apart. The choir was willing. The choir had spent 4,000 years making themselves the most negotiable things in the universe, fluid and foldable, and free of the heavy matter their enemies relied on. They had thought it made them invulnerable. It made them the softest thing for 9,000 kilometers, and the loosening, denied the hard gray hull it had been aimed at, fell back on the soft singers who had made it. Corundal saw it coming the way a man sees a wave that is already too tall to outrun. He had perhaps 30 seconds, by the choir's reckoning of time, between the moment the loosening turned and the moment it reached the great halls. In those 30 seconds, he did the only thing left that was worth doing, and it was the most honest thing he had done in 800 years. He stopped trying to win. He had spent his whole life certain that there was no problem an editor could not edit, no enemy a singer could not unmake, no law that could not be loosened by a good enough song. That certainty had been the floor he stood on, and in the last 30 seconds of the Vorthani choir, Corundal felt the floor go, and in going, it showed him what had been under it the whole time, which was nothing. The choir had never been standing on solid ground. They had been standing on the agreement of the universe, and the universe had agreed, because nothing had ever made it stop, and now a thing had come that did not agree to anything, and the floor was gone, and there had never been a floor at all. He thought, in those last seconds, of the human ship's words to the scribe. We are not here for revenge. Revenge is small. And he understood, far too late to do anything with the understanding, that the humans had told the exact truth. This was not revenge. A creature taking revenge wants the other creature to suffer, to know, to feel the thing being done to it. The last good reason wanted none of that. It had not even fired. It had simply walked into the room where the editing was done, and refused to be edited, and let the editing, denied its target, fall back on the editors. There was no cruelty in it. There was no triumph in it. There was only the plain hard fact of the ship, and the plain hard consequence of aiming 4,000 years of loosening at a thing that would not soften. The humans had not killed the choir. The choir had killed the choir, on the day they first decided that everything could be talked into changing, and the human ship had merely been the thing they finally could not talk. Corundal, finest singer in 3 centuries, 800 years without a defeat, closed his eyes in the last second, and did the one thing the human ship had not denied him. He stopped singing, and in stopping, he found that there was a kind of peace in it, the peace of a creature who has at last met a thing larger than its own certainty, and he was almost grateful, in the final breath, that he had lived long enough to meet it. Olin Vray, in his relay station at the edge of it all, saw the deep records begin to change. This was the thing he would remember longest, longer than the silence that came after. The deep records of the choir, 4,000 years of victories with no defeats, written into the folded fabric of the Reach itself, began to come apart, not erased. The choir had no enemy who could erase them. They were being unagreed, the same way they had unagreed 10,000 enemies before, and the agency doing it was their own great loosening, turned and starving, and looking for soft things to unmake. Corundal sang to hold it. 800 years of skill, the finest singer in 3 centuries, poured everything he was into closing the loosening before it reached the heart of the choir. And for a moment, a long-held breath of a moment, he almost did. He was that good. Even at the end, even wrong, he was that good. But to close the loosening, he needed the local universe to agree to become fixed again. And the only thing in 9,000 kilometers that had refused, from the first second, to agree to anything the choir wanted, was still there, gray and patient, 11 kilometers of indifferent matter, sitting in the dead center of his collapsing working, like a stone in a closing fist. All across the Mael Reach, in the scattered stations and the distant colony folds, the Vorthani who were not editors felt the great halls go. They did not see it the way Alan saw it, on instruments, in records that thinned toward silence. They felt it in the deep sense, the sense every Vorthani was born with, the sense that let them feel the law around a thing. For 4,000 years that sense had carried, always, in the background of every Vorthiani life, a low, warm certainty, the felt presence of the choir, the singers in the great halls who held the universe in its proper shape. It was the thing that made a Vorthiani feel safe. It was the floor under their world. And in the space of a few minutes, across the whole reach, the warm certainty thinned, and guttered, and went out, and 41,000 living Vorthani felt, for the first time in the history of their people, what it was to stand in a universe with no one holding it for them. Some of them screamed, some of them wept, some of them, the youngest, did not understand what had happened, only that the warm thing that had always been there was gone, and they reached for it the way a child reaches for a hand that is no longer holding theirs. And a few of them, the ones who would matter most in the 1,000 years to come, felt the warm certainty go, and felt, underneath the terror of its going, a strange and shameful flicker of something they had no word for, which was relief. Because the warm certainty had also been a weight. It had told them, every moment of their lives, that they were the ones who held the universe, the ones who decided what was real, the ones who could never be wrong. And now that the certainty was gone, a very few of them felt, for the first time, the lightness of not having to be right about everything. They did not understand the feeling. They would spend 1,000 years learning what it was, but it began in that moment, in the dark, when the great halls went silent, and the floor of their world dropped away, and they discovered, falling, that they had never needed the floor at all. The last good reason still had not fired, it still had not turned, it had not needed to. It had brought no weapon to the heart of the choir, because the choir's own power was the only weapon the situation required, and the humans had understood that 60 years ago, when a dying cutter sent home the recommendation, and the recommendation was not, build a bigger gun, the recommendation was, build something they cannot, and walk it into the room where they do the thing they do, and let them do it. There was one last thing the editors tried, in the final seconds, and Olin recorded it because it was the most desperate working his people had ever attempted, and because it failed more completely than anything before it. A dozen of the strongest singers, feeling the loosening turn back on them, did not try to close it. They tried, instead, to throw it. They reached for the whole collapsing region and tried to fold it bodily onto the human ship, to wrap 9,000 kilometers of failing reality around the last good reason, like a net around a fish, so that even if the ship could not be unmade, it might at least be buried, sealed inside a pocket of dead law where it could do no more harm. It was the act of drowning creatures reaching for the thing that was drowning them, and it was the last clever idea the choir would ever have, and it was a good one, and it did not work. The loosening folded onto the human ship exactly as the editors willed it. 9,000 kilometers of unmade reality wrapped around the gray hull, a closing net of pure negotiability, the most absolute prison the choir had ever built, and the last good reason, sitting inside it, plain and hard and indifferent, simply went on being a ship. The net could not close, because to close a net, you need the thing inside it to agree to be caught, and the human ship had never once agreed to anything. The fold, denied a thing to fold around, snapped back on the singers who had thrown it, and the dozen strongest editors of the choir, the last of the last, were unmade by the very working they had hoped would bury their enemy. They had reached for the human ship one final time, and one final time the human ship had not reached back, had not struck, had not even noticed, and the reaching had nowhere to go but home. Olin, watching, understood that this was the whole shape of it, repeated one last time in miniature. Every weapon the choir aimed at the last good reason came back. Every edit, every loosening, every net, every clever, desperate, brilliant idea his people had, the human ship returned to sender, not by deflecting it, not by blocking it, but simply by being a thing against which such ideas had no purchase. The choir had spent 4,000 years learning to make the universe agree. And in the last seconds they learned, all at once, and far too late, that the only true weapon against a thing that refuses to agree is to refuse along with it, and they had never in 4,000 years learned how to refuse anything, because nothing had ever told them no. Corindal's song failed. The loosening closed not on the human ship, but on the choir, and the great folded halls of the male reach, where 40 editors had braided themselves into the largest working in their history, began very quietly to stop having been. And through all of it, from the first failed edit to the last good reason did the single thing the choir found most unbearable. The thing that all in Vray, watching, understood, was the cruelest part of the whole design, though the humans did not mean it as cruelty, and would have called it mercy. It waited. It did not gloat. It did not strike. It did not loose one bolt or beam to hurry the thing along. It simply held its plain hard fact in the center of the choir's softened space, real and indifferent and patient, and let the choir's own 4,000 years of power do to the choir exactly what the choir had done to everyone else. The human ship was not the executioner. The human ship was the wall the choir's own swing came back from, and it stood at the heart of the reach, unmoving, unhurried, while around it the singers learned, in the last minutes any of them would have, what it is to meet a people who do not play by rules at all. Alan Vray, who had braced, watched the deep records thin toward silence, and reached for his stylus to record the temperature of the only dead star that had ever frightened him. On the bridge of the last good reason, no one was singing, and no one was shouting, and that was the whole point of the place. The ship was crewed by 412 people. It carried no editors, no singers, no benders of the law, because such things could not be built, and the humans had stopped wishing they could, a long time ago. It carried welders and gunners, and cooks, and a navigator who had not slept properly in 9 days. It carried a captain named Hadley Brunn, 51 years old, gray at the temples, who had spent the last 6 hours sitting in a chair watching a tactical display that showed a single gray icon, his own ship, sitting motionless at the center of a vast, soft region the instruments could barely describe. Hadley Brunn had read the cutter's report when he was 19. Every one of his generation had. It had been printed in the school books of the wet blue world. 4 calm sentences, from 4 people who had found the talkers and died, telling everyone what beat them, found the ones who edit the law, recommend we build something they cannot. He had read it at 19 and not understood it. He understood it now. His ship had no weapon trained on the choir. The forward batteries were cold. The torpedo racks were full and locked. In 60 years of design and argument and failure, the engineers of the wet blue world had built and scrapped 100 ideas for a gun that could hurt a thing that lived behind folded space. And every one of them had failed, because you cannot shoot a thing that can edit the bullet out of having been fired. So they had stopped trying to build a gun. They had built a fact instead. The last good reason was the densest, plainest, most stubbornly real object the human species had ever assembled. Every system on it was built 3 times over, in 3 different ways, not for redundancy, but for indifference, so that no single edit, no single loosening, no single clever argument from the universe could find one clause to pull. The reactor did not run on any principle the choir could soften. It ran on the oldest principle there was, which was that hot things stay hot and heavy things stay heavy, and a fire lit by a hand, that means it does not go out, because a stranger decides it was never lit. The ship was not armored against the edit. It was simply too plain to edit, the way you cannot argue a brick out of being a brick, no matter how good your argument is. The building of the last good reason had taken 58 years, and Hadley Brunn had grown up alongside it, the way a child grows up alongside a long argument in the next room. The wet blue world had not wanted to build it. That was the thing the choir never knew, and could not have imagined. The humans had argued for almost a decade about whether to build the ship at all, whole generations of them, because the ship was not a small thing, or a cheap thing, or a safe thing. To build a hull that the edit could not reach, the engineers had to abandon every clever principle they had ever discovered, every elegant trick of physics, every shortcut the universe offered. A clever ship is a ship full of clauses, and a clause is a thing that can be loosened. So the last good reason had no clever parts at all. It was the dumbest, plainest, heaviest object the human species knew how to make, 11 kilometers of dense gray matter, holding a fire that burned on the one principle the choir could not soften, which was simply that it was burning, and meant to keep burning, and did not ask permission. It had cost more than anything the wet blue world had ever made. It had cost arguments that split families. It had cost a man named Aldous Kerr, the first engineer to understand what kind of ship would be needed, his entire career, Because for 30 years his own people thought him a fool, building a hull with no shields, and no clever weapons, and no tricks, a brute, a wall, a thing that looked backward instead of forward. Aldous Kerr had died 9 years before the ship was finished, and he had died still arguing, and his last written words had been added to the briefing. Every captain of the Last Good Reason was required to read. They said, "They will tell you it is too plain to be a warship. They will be right. It is not a warship. It is a refusal with a fire in its belly. Build it anyway." Hey, Hadley Brunn had read those words 100 times. He read them again now, in his mind, as the soft region on his tactical display began to fold inward, and he understood at last, sitting in the dead center of the largest working in the history of the Vorthanani Choir, exactly what Aldous Kerr had built, and why it had been worth the cost. The ship was not winning. Winning was the wrong word, a word for an opponent, and the Last Good Reason did not have an opponent any more than a wall has an opponent when a wave breaks against it. The ship was simply being what it was, plain and hard and real, in a place where being plain and hard and real was the one thing no one had ever managed to do, and the choir's 4,000 years of cleverness was breaking against it the way every clever thing eventually breaks against a plain one. Captain Brunn watched the soft region on his display begin to fold inward, and he knew what it meant, because the analysts had told him it would happen exactly like this. 60 years of study compressed into one cold sentence in his briefing. When they loosen reality to unmake you, and you refuse to soften, the loosening has nowhere to go but home. He did not feel triumph. He had been warned about triumph too. The briefing had been clear, and it had been written by people who had thought about this for a long time, and it said one thing in plain hard letters at the very end. We are not bringing a weapon, we are bringing a mirror. Do not gloat at a mirror. So Captain Hadley Brunn sat in his chair and watched the Vorthani Choir's 4,000 years of power fall back on the Vorthani Choir, and he did not gloat. He told his crew to hold position. He told his gunners to keep the batteries cold. He told the navigator, who had not slept in 9 days, to plot a course home for when it was over, because it would be over, and they would go home, and that was the whole of the plan and always had been. And then he opened a channel, because there was one thing left to do that the briefing had insisted on, and it was the thing that made the Last Good Reason different from every monster the choir had ever met. He opened a channel to the relay station at the edge of the dying region, the one that had asked him a question hours before, the small, flat, ugly voice that had said, "What did we do to you?" And he answered the scribe one last time, while there was still a scribe to answer. The crew of the Last Good Reason heard their captain speak, and they understood. The way you understand a thing your whole people have agreed on without ever saying it aloud, that this was the part that mattered. Not the gray hull, not the cold guns, not the great working folding in on the singers who made it. This, the choosing of who lives. Alan Vray received the channel. He was the only one left at the relay station who could. The deep records had thinned past reading. The great folded halls were silent. Across the mail reach, in the places where the editors had braided their song, there was a quiet that Alan's instruments could not measure, because there was nothing left in those places for the instruments to find. 4,000 years of the Vorthasani Choir, the people who edited the law, who had never lost, who had unmade 4 empires and 10,000 fleets and 1 inconvenient star, were becoming a thing that had, very softly, simply stopped. And the human captain's voice came across the channel, flat and plain, stripped of all harmony, in the same ugly register Olin himself had used, as if the humans had learned his language only well enough to be understood, and had not bothered to make it beautiful, because beauty was not the point. The captain said, "Scribe, you asked what you did to us. You did nothing to us that you did not do to 400 peoples before us. That is the answer. That is the only answer there ever is. We are not here because you killed 4 of ours. We are here because you would never have stopped, and no one who could edit the law was ever going to choose to. So someone built a thing you could not edit, and the thing has done what it came to do, and now it is going to go home." Olin listened. Around him, his people ended. The captain said, "You read the old warning. You believed it when no one else did. That is why you are still here to hear this, and they are not. The ship does not choose who lives by accident. We watched who braced. You braced. Your station is outside the loosening. It will hold. When this is finished, You will be the only Vorthonani left who saw it, and you will have a choice to make. And I am going to tell you what the choice is, because the people who built this ship asked me to. Olin Vray, scribe and counter of dead stars, the last of the choir, listened to the human tell him the only thing the last good reason had truly come all this way to say. The captain said, "You can rebuild this. Your people are not gone in a way that cannot come back. The knowledge of how to edit the law is in you, in your records, in your blood. In 1,000 years there can be a choir again, and it can do exactly what this choir did, and reach out across the dark and unmake anyone soft enough to argue with. And if it does, we will know, because we are watching now, and we will not stop watching, and we will build another ship, plainer and harder, and more patient than this one, and we will walk it up the throat of the reach again, and we will not open a channel the second time." Or, the captain said, and his flat, plain voice did not change, did not soften, did not threaten, simply laid the thing down like a stone on a table. Or you can rebuild it differently. You spent 4,000 years learning to make the universe agree with you. Spend the next 4,000 learning to live in a universe that does not. That is all we ever wanted from you. Not your death. Your death is small. We wanted you to learn the one thing your gift made it impossible for you to learn, which is that you are not the only ones who are real, and that the things you can edit can also, sometimes, be people. You unmade 4 of ours and filed them under negligible. Build a choir that could never write that word. Then we will leave you alone forever. There was a silence on the channel. And then Captain Hadley Brunn said the last thing, and it was not for the records, and Olin never told anyone what it was, though he carried it for the rest of his long life, and it changed the shape of everything he built afterward. The captain said, "We named the ship The Last Good Reason, because building it was the last good reason we had to believe we could win against a thing like you. We were tired of being edited out of the dark, and told it was nothing. This was the reason we stopped talking. Do not give us a reason to build the next one. Brace, scribe. It is almost done. Then go home." The channel closed. Olin Vray turned to his instruments. The great loosening was nearly spent. At the heart of the male reach, where 40 editors had sung the largest working in the history of his people, there was a stillness so complete that his deep sense, the sense every Vorthani was born with, the sense that let them feel the law around a thing, found nothing to feel at all. The choir was gone. Not all of it. Outposts at the edges, stations like his that had braced, ships that had been too far out to join the working, scattered children of the Reach, who had never sung an edit in their lives. They remained. They were the seed the human captain had spoken of. They were the 1,000 years. And in the dead center of it all, the thing that had done it sat unmoving, gray and patient, 11 kilometers of plain, hard, indifferent matter, lit along its flanks by the dull orange glow of a fire that no one in 4,000 years had been able to talk out of burning. The last good reason had not fired one shot. It had not lost one soul. It had not turned, fled, faltered, or failed at any point from the moment it entered the Reach. It had done the one thing the choir had never planned for, because the choir had built their whole world on the certainty that everything could be talked into changing. The human ship had simply refused, and the refusal had been enough, because the refusal was the only thing in the universe the choir's gift could not touch. And the humans had spent 60 patient years building a hull around it and aiming it up the throat of the dark. Olin Vray watched the human ship come about, slow and unhurried, and begin the long, quiet journey back down the throat of the Reach, toward the wet blue world that had built it. He should have felt hatred. He searched himself for it. He was the last witness of the end of his people, and the thing that had ended them was sailing calmly home, and any reasonable creature would have hated it. He could not find the hatred. He found, instead, the note of Thelm Sa, 900 years old, and he understood now that she had not been predicting an enemy. She had been predicting a teacher. One day we will meet a people who do not play by rules at all. On that day, our gift will be a closed door, and what is behind the door will not knock. What was behind the door had not knocked. It had not needed to. It had simply stood there, real and plain and unwilling to pretend it was anything else, until the choir's whole clever world broke against it. Olin Vray picked up his stylus, and he began, for the first time in 212 years, to write something that was not the temperature of a dead star, The last good reason took 9 days to leave the male reach, and Alan watched every hour of it. He had nowhere else to look. His station held, exactly as the human captain had said it would, at the edge of the region where the great loosening had spent itself. The instruments still worked, the lights still burned. Around him, in the long quiet halls, the temperature of the dead stars went on being recorded by machines that did not know anything had changed. But Olun did not return to his old task. He sat at the great window, and he watched the gray hull slide back down the throat of the dark, slow, and patient and silent, lit along its flanks by the dull orange fire, and he counted, because counting was the only thing he had ever known how to do, and because somebody had to count what was left. He counted the dead first. This took a long time, and it was not a number Olin would ever say aloud, because the human captain had warned him about it without meaning to. You unmade 4 of ours and filed them under negligible. Olin had a number now, a vast number, the editors and the singers and the great folded halls and 4,000 years of records, and he understood that the worst thing he could do with it was file it. So he did not file it. He carried it. He let it be heavy. He let it be exactly as heavy as the 4 the choir had unmade and called nothing, and then he let it be heavier, because there were more of them, and a thing that is heavier should weigh more, and that was the entire lesson, and his people had needed 4,000 years and 1 gray ship to learn it. Then he counted the living. There were more than he had feared. The human ship had been precise about who it ended and who it spared, and the precision had a shape, and the shape was mercy disguised as arithmetic. Every Vorthani who had reached for the human ship to unmake it was gone. Every Vorthani who had braced was not. The outposts at the rim of the reach held. The scattered children who had never sung an edit held. 3 colony folds where the choir grew its young, far from the great halls, untouched by the working, held. Olin counted 41,000 Vortholani still alive across the male reach, and not one of them was an editor, and he understood that this, too, was the design. The human ship had not killed his people. It had killed the part of his people that could edit the law, and it had left every part that could learn to live without doing so. It had performed, with a hull of plain gray matter and no weapon at all, the single most precise act of surgery in the history of the dark, and it had done it by standing still and refusing to be talked out of existing. On the 5th day, the last good reason passed near enough to Olin's station that he could see it clearly through the great window, not as an icon on an instrument, but as a thing, real and present, gray and scarred and enormous. It did not slow. It did not turn its cold batteries toward him. It did not so much as acknowledge that the station was there. It simply passed, on its way home, the way a verdict passes out of a courtroom when the courtroom is no longer of any interest to it. And Olin Vray, the last witness, the only scribe, did a thing he had not planned and could not explain. He opened the channel one final time, and he did not ask a question, because he had no more questions. He sent the only thing he had left to send, which was a record. He sent the human ship the note of Thelm Sa, 900 years old, the warning his people had ignored. He sent it because he wanted the humans to know that one Vorthani, long ago, had seen them coming, and had told the truth about what they were, and had been right. The last good reason received it, and after a moment, the flat, plain, ugly voice of Captain Hadley Brunn came back across the dark one last time, and it had changed, just slightly, just at the edges, the way a hard voice changes when it has heard a thing it did not expect. The captain said, "She was right. Keep her name. A people that produces one Thelm Sa can produce another, and the next one you should listen to." And then the gray hull was past, sliding down the throat of the reach toward the shelf and the long road home, and Olin Vray was alone, with 41,000 of his living people, and a number of his dead, that he would carry for the rest of his days, and a choice the human captain had laid on a table like a stone. He thought about the choice for a long time. He could rebuild the choir as it had been. The knowledge was not gone. It was in him, in the records that had survived at the rim, in the blood of the colony folds where the young grew. In 1,000 years there could be editors again, singers again, a choir again, reaching out across the dark to unmake anyone soft enough to argue. He could give that to his people. It would feel, for a time, like healing. It would feel like getting back the thing that had been taken. And one day, Plainer and harder, and more patient than before, a thing would come up the throat of the reach again, and the second time there would be no channel, and no choice on a table, and no scribe left alive to count the living. Or, Alan Vray, who counted things, made the only count that had ever mattered. He weighed 4,000 years of being the most feared people in the dark against the 41,000 living souls in his care, and he found that the fear had never once made them safe. It had only made them certain. And certainty, the human captain had taught him, was the softest thing in the universe, the thing that broke first against a fact that did not care. So Alan Vray chose the other road, and because he was the last scribe and the only witness, the choice became his people's choice, the way the human captain's words had become the choice in the first place. He did not rebuild the choir. He rebuilt something else, and it took the rest of his long life, and the lives of those he taught, and it would take 1,000 years to finish, exactly as the human captain had said. He gathered the 41,000 living, the children who had never sung, the rim folk who had braced, and he gave them not the gift of editing the law, but the harder gift, the human gift, the one their whole history had made nearly impossible for them to receive. He taught them to live in a universe that did not agree with them. He taught them that the comet in the wrong orbit was a real thing that had been moved, and that the star that had never formed had been a place where someone might have lived, and that the 4 humans filed under negligible had been people, and that the word negligible was the most dangerous word any tongue had ever produced, because it was the word you used to make a thing soft enough to unmake. He named the new people after the warning that had been ignored. He named them the folk of Thelm-Sa, and he wrote at the head of their first record, in the plain, ugly register the human captain had used, stripped of all 14 graces, a single line that every Vorthani child would learn before any other. The line said, "We met a people who do not play by rules at all, and they did not unmake us. They left us a door. We choose to be the kind who knock." The rebuilding did not go smoothly, and Olin would not have trusted it if it had. There were Vorthani among the 41,000 who did not want the harder gift. There were those who remembered the great halls, the warm certainty, the felt presence of the choir, and who wanted it back, and who said so loudly, and who called Olin a traitor for refusing to rebuild what had been lost. They had a point, and Olin never pretended they did not. He had watched his people die. He carried the heavy number of them, and here he was, the last witness, telling the survivors that the thing which had been taken from them should never be rebuilt, that the gift their whole history was built upon was the very thing that had killed them. It was a hard thing to ask of a grieving people, and many of them hated him for asking it, and Olun let them, because the human captain had taught him that a thing which is true does not have to argue, it only has to refuse. And Olun refused, year after year, to give his people back the certainty that had broken them. He won the argument the only way such arguments are ever won, which is slowly, and by living long enough. The Vorthani who wanted the old choir back grew old and died, most of them, still wanting it. But their children, raised by Olwen and the Rim folk, and the elder Quarren who had fled the great halls, grew up never having felt the warm certainty, and so they did not miss it, and so they did not want it back. Because you cannot grieve a thing you never had. And the children of those children grew up learning, before any other lesson, that the universe did not agree with them, and never had, and that this was not a wound, but simply the truth, and that a people who knew it could live in the dark without needing to hold the dark in their fist. It took 3 generations. It took the patience the human ship had shown them, the patience that had walked up the throat of the reach, and stood still and waited. But it took, the way a slow true thing takes. And by the time Olun was very old, the folk of Thelm-Sa were a people in their own right, plainer and harder and kinder than the choir had ever been. And they did not edit the law, and they did not want to. And the thing that had been a wound in the first generation was, by the third, simply who they were. The last good reason reached the wet blue world after a long quiet voyage, and it was not celebrated the way the Vorthayani might have imagined, with songs and triumph, and the parading of an unmade enemy. The humans did not parade it. The humans had built it to do a thing that needed doing, and the thing was done, and the ship was brought home and cleaned, and its cold batteries inspected, and its full torpedo racks unloaded, untouched, Every weapon it had carried up the throat of the Reach carried back down again unused. Captain Hadley Brunn made his report. The report was short. It said the choir would not be a threat to anyone again, and that it might, in 1,000 years, be something better. It said no shot was fired, and no soul was lost. It said the ship had performed exactly as designed, which was to be a fact that could not be argued with, in a place that had never met one. And then, because the humans were a careful people who had learned their care the hard way, they did not scrap the last good reason. They did not mothball it. They kept it crude, and kept its fire burning, and kept it ready, parked in a slow orbit above the wet blue world, where anyone who wished to could look up and see it, 11 kilometers of plain gray matter lit along its flanks by a dull orange glow, a fact in the sky, a thing that did not care what the universe had decided. Because the briefing had been right about one more thing, the thing that mattered most, the thing the humans had learned across 10,000 years of their own brief, brutal history, before they ever met a single alien. A people who can edit the law will tell you they have stopped. A people who change the rules will swear the changing is over. And the only thing that ever holds them to it, the only thing that has ever held anyone to anything, is a plain, hard, patient fact sitting where they can see it, refusing to be talked out of being there. The last good reason was that fact. It hung above the wet blue world, and it watched the dark, and it waited, the way it had waited in the heart of the Mael Reach, calm and unhurried and entirely real, for any people, anywhere, who decided they were the only ones who got to be. Far out along the Orion Shelf, at the edge of the Mael Reach, the folk of Thelmsaw grew slowly into the 1,000 years the human captain had given them. They did not edit the law, they learned its weather instead. They built ships of plain heavy matter, the way their teachers had taught them, ugly and dense and stubborn, and they sent them out not to unmake anyone but to look, to count, to carry the heavy true number of every living thing they found, and never once let it go soft enough to call negligible. And on the prow of every ship they built, in the plain ugly register of a people who had stopped needing things to be beautiful, they wrote 4 words they had learned from the dark. Nothing survives a closed door. Alan Vray lived a very long time, longer than most of his people, long enough to see the first generation of the folk of Thelmsaw grow up never having heard an edit sung. He died at his great window, watching the dark throat of the Reach, recording, to the very end, the temperature of dead stars, because some habits are worth keeping, even after everything else has changed. And in his last record, beneath the last cold number, he wrote one line more, the line he had never told anyone, the last thing the human captain had said to him across the channel that day, the thing that had changed the shape of everything he built. The captain had said, "The ship is not the lesson, scribe. The ship is just the proof. The lesson is that you are real, and so was everyone you ever unmade, and a thing that is real does not have to argue. It only has to refuse. Go home. Teach them to refuse the right things." Alan Vray wrote it down. Then he set down his stylus for the last time, and he looked out at the dark where a gray ship had come once, slow and patient and silent, 11 kilometers of plain hard matter that nothing in 4,000 years had been able to talk out of existing, and he understood, with the cold, clear certainty of a man who has counted everything there is to count, that his people were alive because a thing had come up the throat of the Reach that did not fail, did not falter, did not fire, and did not lose. The warning had been true, all of it, every word, exactly as it came in 11 hours before the ship. Brace yourself. A human warship is incoming. Nothing survives. Nothing the choir had been survived. The certainty did not survive. The 4,000 years of editing the law did not survive. The word negligible did not survive. And in the space where all of it had been, where a people had once been so sure they were the only ones who were real, something else had been allowed to grow, plainer and harder and kinder than what came before. Because the thing that came up the throat of the dark had been built by a people who knew the difference between an enemy you destroy and an enemy you teach, and had chosen, with cold guns and full racks and a fire that would not go out, to do the harder of the two. The folk of Thelmsaw kept the human warning carved on the rim of the Reach for as long as their people endured, and they did not carve it as a threat, and they did not carve it as a wound. They carved it as the plainest true thing they knew, the thing that had remade them, the thing their teacher had counted at his great window until the day he died. Brace yourself. A human warship is incoming, and nothing you were too certain to question will survive the day it arrives.